The first thing I wanted to talk to you about is the kind of agility that is visible or that is at work in all of these pieces of William Forsythe. Where does it come from? This kind of extreme ability to transform, to transpose, to deplace, to replace. How do you arrive at this kind of not only dexterity physically, but it seems like there's always an extreme mental dexterity or agility at work?
Yeah, I think that that comes from the basis of the work has a lot to do with increasing the ability to differentiate between categories of ideas and of motion and of form and of dynamic. So we spend a lot of time working on seeing and looking at things and saying, okay, you know, we can categorically say this is a glass full of water. We can also say there's a number of different volumes that are evident. There's a different quality of I see refractions coming from that light. I also see the reflection of somebody's face over here. At the same time, there's a straight line, there's a circle, there's a flat surface underneath it. It comes from China. You know, who knows what the categories are that are evident in this glass. And then also to say, what haven't we noticed yet about what this also is, or what it might become, which is one of the things that Bill talks about a lot, and thinks about a lot in his work, is what is this that we haven't yet noticed, or what might it be also? So the kind of agility that, the physical agility that comes has to do with saying, okay, you know, rather than here's a form, saying here's this form, which is the product of a dynamic directionality. It's the product of a historical referencing to certain ideas that come out of categories of motion. It's also connected to, it's a relational issue in the body. And so to say, okay, I can take this form. I can also take aspects of this form and transform it by saying, this is also, this is a curve that's moving to the left. This is also in a curve that's moving to the left. This is the line that can be translated into other places in space. I can take it apart as a number of smaller entities that have come together to create this one form. So it becomes like a proliferating cloud of ideas that come out from one thing, which can also be seen as a single object or event. So to say, and that's where, so rather than say, okay, let's come up with the next step, what are we going to do? We'll often say, okay, where are we right now? What are the conditions of the situation we're in? What is that producing? What other conditions might we put in place that might create something else? What happens if we place this in a set of different conditions? What if there were conditions that we can't imagine? How can we move toward things that we haven't yet imagined? And so the physical and the mental agility, I think, is a practice thing. We practice it a lot, becoming less enamored of our own ideas and of, you know, less attached to a specific manifestation of something. So things change all the time. Like this piece that we're doing right now has changed every day.
Well, what's changing then? Because you could say that the stable thing, if any, is the procedure according to which you are developing the work, and the work is always different, but the procedure is the same, or how can we think of this?
So there's a procedure, and then there's also, I would say the work itself is a manifestation of the basic DNA of the piece, which is not necessarily connected to the current manifestation of the piece. And you know, as time changes and the situation changes and the people change, sometimes this particular flower doesn't make any sense anymore. And so you have to go back down and say, okay, where's this coming from, and what might it be now?
So it's interesting you talk about DNA, because it has always been said that ballet was like the foremost or the first source of inspiration, but actually you're now talking about a cloud of inspiration more than DNA is like something that has no name. I mean, you cannot decipher it, or you can hardly decipher it. It's something that you know is there, but everybody thinks about it in a different way. And then you try testing each other's ideas about things. Is this how you work?
Sorry, I didn't quite understand the question. Tell me more.
Well, that it's like if you talk about DNA, it's something that is almost absent, that is there, and we know it's there, but at the same time, everybody probably has his own concept about what this DNA then is.
Yeah.
So actually, it's in talking and talking and talking, or trying and trying and trying, that you get to understand the piece.
Yeah, because that's exactly often the point, is that we don't necessarily know what the piece is and what's made it work. Because it's not, especially with Bill's work, it's not like he says, I am now going to create a piece that will, allow us to see blah, blah, blah. But he'll start. He has an idea that he trusts in, but he's not attached to. He's he allows for change to a really radical degree, He's really willing to say, this is what I'm imagining moving toward, but he'll be like, let's go over here instead. And so the piece, as it comes out, then of course his intervention into the group and into the space is then filtered through the ideas of all the artists. And a lot of times we don't know exactly where what emerges comes from, what its basis is. We have a lot of ideas about it, and we understand to some degree our own background and what we're working on. But the piece itself, and it's often happened, that, for example, someone will be gone and we'll have to replace somebody, and we think we know how we're gonna teach it. We say, okay, here's how it goes. You think this and you do this, and it totally won't work. And it's because we didn't really know what made it work. So then we have to go back and try. And as you say, we spend a lot of time trying, I would say, for sure, and especially in these pieces where the structure exists. For example, in Study 3, there's a very a strong structural basis, and within which artists are making decisions. And
could you say what the structural basis is in Study number 3?
Well, there's I think Bill can probably speak to that better later, exactly how he forms it. Yeah.
Because there's one other question, as you're explaining, I think, okay, Bill comes with an idea, and then we see if it works, like this. What's the idea like? But then also, it works. What does that mean? Because it's an operative term. It's something like architects also do that, or oh yeah, this works, but nobody knows why and how. But it's like, So, do you try to define more what it works is, and what comes out of that? And also, this first idea, is it a book that is on the table, or is it a slamming door, or is it? What is it?
It's always different. It really is always different. Each piece, the basis of the initial impulse, I would say for the most part, always comes from Bill. And sometimes he'll come in and say, I want to work with this text, or sometimes he'll come in and say, I want to work. I'm just thinking of, for example, something like the loss of small detail, which was a point where there was kind of a shift, I would say, where we started to work on being able to differentiate more clearly what it means to have a focus. Like because we had at that point, we're working a lot with the classical, which has a very directed kind of focus that allows you to differentiate geometrically and kind of curvilinearly between motion and form. And Bill said, let's do what we eventually started calling disfocus, as a way to say, okay, so what does it mean? So I can have a focus that is directed forward in the room. I can have a focus that's moving backwards somehow. So how do we take where we've been going and go the opposite direction? What does it mean? Without just doing the same thing but going in another way. So it's the way we work is changing all the time. It's not. There's nothing I could name that would say that's how he always works.
But this focus would be like an idea, and then you start working.
No,
And
it was.
it's a topic.
I think
thing, or like
that one he came in and he said he didn't talk about it. I mean, a lot of times he doesn't talk about it either. Eventually, because he doesn't like to nail things down before we get there. But he danced. So a lot of times has come in with a danced idea, and then because the dancing is a form of thinking that dancers can work on together without having to nail it down and say what it is. We can say, okay, if I see that, how do I connect to that? What do I think in relationship to that? So he, for example, in Lost Small Detail, he danced on video. He danced and they videoed it, and then we learned. Like I learned the material that he had danced for me. And in the process of working on learning it from video, we started to start to think about, okay, what's happening here? All right, there, for example, physically, in that instance, there was this kind of new way of allowing the hips to be the central point from within which things started to move out in like rippled fractals, I would say, that curved, and then the piece, it's extremely organic process, and it's extremely unlinear process for the most part.
You often hear and see texts in the performances. As I hear you talking now, I would say that these texts are disentangled or dismantled already before they come on stage. So how do you think people relate to the texts you use on stage? Because they're often not very easy either.
I mean, I don't know. What do you think?
Well, for the most part, they make my head swirl around. Mostly, it's like, where do they want me to go? Because usually they help you to explain something, and in this case, usually they help you to they send you somewhere away. And
yeah, I mean, it's like a straight theater text will say, someone will walk in and say, "What are you doing?" And another text that we use might be more like a room that within which something happens, or it might be a way of speaking to somebody that is more like a dream speaks to you. Is that it has its basis in something that needs to be communicated, and something that can only be communicated through channels that are like this.
It's surrealist poetry, then, in a way.
Well, I don't know. I would hesitate to say it's surrealist poetry. I would say but that we're accustomed to using language like we use motion. In the sense of allowing it to
as pure communication, as this stands for that, and so we use it all the time in the same way. Like a chair is a chair, and you would say, well, a chair could be an airplane, maybe, if we think about it, or we could say airplane to this chair or whatever.
Well,
exchanging things, replacing them.
No, but not necessarily that it's irreplaceable. For example, we use language a lot of different ways. So in for example, heterotopia, which I think you saw somewhere, it's fake language. But it's totally obvious what people are talking about. You know exactly what people are saying, but it's fake. A lot of times I use real language, and oftentimes it's intelligible in the sense of it makes sense and it connects to what's happening. Or sometimes it appears not to connect to what's happening, but it shifts the context within which you understand what else is happening in the room.
Well, in study number 3, it certainly makes sense at the end of the performance. I mean, the piece would be completely different without your text. No?
Yeah.
And is this, to come back to a former thing, is this kind of part of the structure that this text comes at the end, would you say?
I think that's a question for Bill. I would imagine that that is part of the structure. Yeah.
But what about working with a text that comes from the outside? Because you wrote a lot of text yourself.
Yeah.
So you were often like the ghostwriter or the playwright or of these pieces. What about texts that come from outside? Like in Decreation, it was actually based on another text.
Well, for example, in Kamer, we had a text from Caspersen and from what was his name? Douglas Martin, thank you. And in that piece we took, which we actually have not done so often, take text from the outside. Or sometimes we do take short text and they get woven into the structure. Kamer was a different piece because it was really based on these two texts really strongly. So Bill took them and wove the texts together within the work. So we use it essentially the same as we use any text that we use. Bill's written a lot of texts, I've written a lot of texts, and sometimes we have things from the outside.
Well, it became very conspicuous for me these last years, but then you said no, we did it all the time, but it was the use of the human voice became very prominent for me. Do you have any idea why that was? It's like it's the human voice then doing almost anything you could do with the human voice, like barking or screeching or singing or talking nonsense or and it has been like in Heterotopia, it's almost like the vehicle that connects the two parts of the piece. So it has become a really like the motor next to movement. It has become a kind of motor of pieces.
Yeah, in for example in Heterotopia, we've been working with creating our own vocal scores that are scores for the other people to dance to. So we create, and I think maybe Freya will talk about this. She's been thinking a lot about vocal scores, audio scores. We've always used language. I think maybe in the last years, there's also a lot of people in the company right now who are good at using their voices in ways that that help create situations within which dancers can work. I think it always has to do with the artists that you have too.
But well, Heterotopia, and then the next piece, Angolo Oscuro, this use of voices.
Yeah.
Almost seemed to make for characters. It was suddenly as if, like in all these former pieces, it was as if characters were absent or dissolving, if there were any character-like presences. But then in these voices make for very distinct ways of being present. I would say more than movement does, but I can be mistaken. How do you think about that?
I guess I don't have the same experience of that because I've been doing characters for many years that had distinct voices, but maybe it's become more distributed throughout the group. And for example, Angelo has a really strong instance of the constant use of voice combined with motion to create these distinct behavioral states. So it's less that they're like characters, although they come across as characters, but it's more that we're looking at, and I think that's one thing that's been happening more over the last 10 years or so is, it happened before, and now it's happening maybe more, is to say, okay, what is the behavioral state that we might enter into, each individual artist, and how can we become more differentiated in our ability to create different kinds of states that allow for different types of events or experiences for the audience or the other performers.
Do you use them as building stones? Are they an element in building a piece, or
they emerge during the building of the piece?
At what moment? I try to imagine
how it works. Well, for example, Angolo Oscuro we made, and in Angolo Oscuro I play this kind of terrible baby, and the baby wasn't even in the first version. So that's how kind of things go. We made this piece, and then at a certain point, I was imitating some babies, just in the hall or whatever, and Bill said, "Okay, go try to do that." And so I try to do that, and then out of that, I eventually created a character, or a kind of a set of behavioral elements that produce this character.
How hard is it to work with uncertainty on the stage? I mean, I've been reading again this description you made of alien action, and I thought, well, I would be frightened out of my mind to be on the stage with instructions like this, with 130 movement bits, and then 4 directions and 4 instructions, and then you have to change when somebody else is doing something. You have to follow or change or. And even in reading it, I was lost. I had to read it a few times, and I thought like.
But you know what?
How do you do it?
Well, it's a community of practice. So we literally practice it all day, all the time, and having. We're very accustomed to constantly shifting structure, shifting content, and in general, the overall idea, like you become as a performer, you know, you can feel the nature of what the work is, to some degree, and what the work of a performer is to continuously be able to not hang on to what you think it is, but keep looking at where you are and figure out what the right thing to do is. Mm-hmm. And so it's not uncertainty, but it's fluidity and this and practicing the ability to respond in a way that makes sense, and it's fun. I like it. You know,
the presence of an audience. What does that to this kind of? Does it enhance this awareness of what is happening around you, or
well,
is it important to have an audience? Because as you describe it now, it seems like an exercise you get better in the group, and it makes for a community. But how do you think about an audience in that kind of, or what does it mean for you as a performer?
To have an audience.
Of this audience.
Yeah. Well, the audience is, you know, if you're doing a performance, the audience on some level is the point. Because if I can go in a room and dance, and I can be connected to dancing, and that's one thing. But if I'm going to make a performance, then there's a reason to do that, and it has to do with transmission of something, or some kind of a shared experience that I'm attempting to enable. So the presence of audience sharpens your she says sharpens my, it sharpens your focus and it creates a tension, a pressure. It can make it, you know, if you're frightened or you get nervous or whatever, it can make it harder, but that's part of the work of a performer, is to develop kind of a robust ability to remain fluid. And to, even when, you know, when things go wrong and you mess everything up, to step right back and go, okay, I'm just going to pull it together and reconnect to what's happening, because it's all about this constant reconnection. So it's never like you get in a performance, it's perfect and you connected everything. There's always moments where you have to just keep reconnecting. It's a constant practice, kind of like a mindfulness practice on some level, which has a very wild platform within which it's happening.
Could you still work for another choreographer?
I haven't worked with another choreographer in so long that I'm not sure what people are doing. In that sense, what it would be like.
No, I'm wondering, because this responsibility you get is huge. In a sense, you are the co-authors of the work all the time.
Yeah, and that's why, you know, I've been in this company for I guess 26 years. Is that not only is Bill a person who not only allows for, but in himself requires a kind of motion in terms of what's going on. He doesn't like to stay with what was, but he really values and hopes for, or is really happy to see when ideas kind of come up in the room from other people, and he wants artists that he's working with. He doesn't want to tell everybody what to do and have them do it. you know. So it's been a fascinating place to work, and for exactly that reason, is that it can be terrifying, you know, and very challenging, and but it's like this kind of, when I first got here, I had two words came to my mind, which still come to my mind when I think of Bill's work or our work together, is this fierce joy, which is that it's not about, you know, we're going to make these awesome moves or we're going to create like a really radical whatever. We're trying to connect to something that is this kind of a ferocious joy inside of people and inside of situations. And what is theater for, you know?
Has that to do with failure also, or the possibility of failure, or even kind of enjoying failure? If you talk about fierce joy, I would say like...
Well, I don't think I do enjoying failure, but for sure failure is right in there. I mean, it's this constant failure. I mean, that's one of the things I love about dancers, is that the practice is so failure bound on some level that every morning you go in and you do class and you practice the same thing for 30 years every morning. But it's never like, I've done it, I got that tendu, I'm finished. It's like, oh God, I didn't, okay, whoops. Try that again, okay. Oh God, okay. Just over and over. And so dancers are used to doing that and used to it falling apart, because everything falls apart every day. And so you're riding this wave of this kind of rolling cloud of change. And yeah.
Maybe it's interesting, class every day. So what do you start with?
Well, you know, in this company has been done ballet class every day. So you start with a plie, which is standing up and bending your knees, essentially.
So it's really 1 hour, 2 hours?
It's an hour and 15 minutes, our class, yeah.
And then it's working on rehearsals, new pieces?
So we have class and then we have rehearsal all day.
You told me that you are about to stop dancing in some time, but that somehow you take this experience with you for another practice. So I think it's interesting that you tell this to people, because I was very fascinated by this idea that you could use movement practices in a completely different field, or this kind of experience you had there in a completely different field.
I've went and got a master's degree in conflict studies and mediation, so I'm working in conflict fields, and I've been developing projects that bridge. When I first got into conflict, I said I'm not going to get involved in any kind of bogus arts-based, conflict stuff. And so I totally ignored it for about 4 years. And then I started to slowly realize that all of this work, all these transformative practices and this kind of like very nuts and bolts approach to transformation that dance artists practice is very valuable. So then I started thinking, okay, how does this translate into these other fields? And what I was talking about yesterday is I was working with a big group of mediators, conflict mediators, and they asked me, what can we do physically? And so I said, I don't know if this has any value, but let's try it. So we did some experiments. And we took a process from a piece called Bees of the Invisible, where you make one solo, and then somebody else stands next to the person doing the solo and essentially gets out of the way of the first person as they do it, but keeps coming back. So you create a solo that's in relationship to the dynamic and the timing and the spatial elements of the first solo. And you do that with 3 people. So you have 3 solos related to this initial solo, and then you remove the initial solo. So then you just have these 3 people who are connected through something that is no longer present. And so I took that and I said, all right, let's try that. Let's take a conflict, and let's create a physical equivalency for the initial onset of the conflict. And then let's create these other 3 elements in relationship to it. How are you in relationship to that initial thing? Take out the first one. And I was surprised to see how powerful it is to see physical equivalencies of events, and how the ability to actually watch it happen allows people to experience more strongly the effect, for example, in that instance, of past behavior or past instances on what's happening now and how current repetition can be the result of something that's no longer even happening.
Mm-hmm. So it's refocusing, actually. It's making visible and then taking it out again and
Yeah,
watching how you act upon something that
exactly, yeah.
might not be there anymore.
Yeah, so creating a framework, using these ideas to create frameworks within which people can see more clearly. So it's back to the same thing about differentiated, the ability to see in a differentiated way.
Mm-hmm.
Bill is deeply musical. I guess I don't even use the word music because our physical work is so, I guess, the way it is musical. It's constant, especially the use of the voice. I'm constantly in relationship to, for example, Tom Willem's work, to the structure of the piece, to the other voices that are happening. It's a deeply musical practice. And I guess I don't think about the word musical, I think about the words like rhythm, connection, which is the basis, but probably the word musical also applies because it is, I was doing last night in the piece, there's a part where I'm talking with another person who's talking and we're in relationship to music that goes in and out and the dancers. And it's a big weave that we're creating in the moment. And it's essentially a musical composition. I think that's very true, yeah. We're just memorizing in different categorical levels. So there's a categorical level of like, I'm going to go 1, 2, and 3, 4, 5, 6. Or there's a category that says you're going to drop your heel and swing your elbow within the framework of a 10-second period. Or there's something that says you're going to sit in a chair and face 30 people in a dark room and speak. And at some point, there's going to be some motion involved with your elbow and your foot. So it depends on what category level we decide to fix things at. Does that make sense, Bill, what you're saying?
I'm a bit curious about the 150 changes, 150 times changing.
Yeah.
Is it when something is bothering you or Bill, or when does it occur?
Well, for example, in Artifact, Bill talks about how he's worked on it for 25 years. And some of it has to do with, over time, you just keep improving it. Some of it has to do with the artist changing, or the situation changing, or it being 20 years later.
That's the transmission thing also, like a new dancer comes in, so you have to...
That's one element, yeah.